Welcome to the place where we gain knowledge through the lens of creativity. I am Aaron Dworkin, and this is Artful Science. Thanks again for joining me here on Artful Science. Today's show is The Big Melt, Why Losing Our Ice Matters. And our guest is Sally Benson, professor in the Department of Energy Resources and Engineering in the School of Earth, Energy, and Environmental Sciences, and former co-director of Stanford's Precourt Institute for Energy. Sally, welcome to the show.
Thank you, Aaron. Terrific to be here with you. I'm really excited about today's discussion.
Absolutely. Well, and thanks again so much. So, everyone, of course, talks about climate change, all reasonable. People seem to know that it exists. But really beyond that, I find is a lot of confusion often when we actually really delve into what climate change is, et cetera, and what the actual impact is of these changes. So we figured here on Artful Science, we'll talk about ice. So obviously we think we've got a lot of ice at our poles. So why don't we just start off with kind of understanding ice? Like do we know how much ice we currently have?
We actually do. And I must say, I love ice. I've actually been to the Arctic. I've been to the Antarctic. They're some of my most favorite places on this planet. They're just so incredibly beautiful, and the ice itself is really gorgeous. So I encourage everybody to learn more about ice. It comes in every color imaginable, from bright blue to white to black. And anyway, look into ice. So,
wow.
Okay,
and so sorry, just a quick question with that. Since you've been both to the Arctic and the Antarctic, is there any key kind of difference when you're there? Like, say you're just there standing on the swath of miles and miles of ice. Is there a key difference?
Yeah, the big difference is that in Antarctica, you're actually on a continent and the ice is basically on land. So there's lots of places you can walk around on land. When you go to the Arctic, actually the main ice is just floating out in the middle of the ocean. And it's much more dicey to go walk around there. So you have to be more on boats there. So Antarctica, you can go hike around, and the Arctic is more watching from the sea.
Fascinating. Yeah. Awesome. So ice in total, we actually know how much ice we have. We
do. And I'm going to talk about sort of the different kinds of ice. There are two types of ice. One of them, like the Arctic, is ice that floats on water. Okay. And the other kind of ice is ice that sits on top of land. Okay. And, the big question is like, what about ice and what's bad? And I will say that losing both types of ice is bad. But loss of the ice from the land is much more devastating than the loss of ice from the sea. And let me explain why. Okay. So let's start at the ice at the North Pole. I mentioned that that's basically just like ice floating out in the ocean. And the way it forms is simply it gets so cold up there. It's so dark, and like it's 24 hours a day dark. And it's so cold that it just like literally the ocean freezes. So you get this big, shelf of ice, or
right.
Thing of ice up there. So it's really big, actually, how much ice forms. In the middle of the winter, that will be 5.7 million square miles. So you might go, well, how big is that? That's the same size as the entire continent of South America. So imagine a huge mass as big as South America sitting there that is a frozen ocean. Okay.
Wow. Okay.
And amazing. So every summer, like about half of it melts though, right? Because during the summer, it's light 24 hours a day. It really warms up. Sea ice melts both from the top and the bottom from the ocean. And so it shrinks. And over time, it's shrinking more and more and more. But when that ice melts, since it's already floating on the sea, it doesn't really change the sea level very much, right? It's not going to
Ah,
change it.
okay.
It's like if you have a glass of ice water, and if you have ice cubes in it, and it all melts, the
Gotcha.
level of the water in the glass is not going to be very different.
Gotcha.
Okay. So the other kind of ice is, again, I said ice that sits on land. And I mentioned that Antarctica is actually a big continent, and people don't even know it because it's buried in ice, but it's actually the fifth largest continent on Earth. So,
Wow.
so pretty stunningly large.
Wow.
And if we look at on top of the Antarctic continent, there's ice that's 1.2 miles deep, right? So imagine it's like a gigantic mountain range, but it's built of ice.
Wow.
So that's a lot of water. Now, what happens if you take all that water that's sitting on land and you let it melt and go into the ocean? Well, the ocean is going to rise. Okay. So the amount it will rise is about 200 feet. All the oceans around the world would rise 200 feet if all that ice melts. So that's a lot, right? So there's one other place. Well, another cool statistic. So what volume is that? It would be like if the whole moon was made of water. Something as big as the moon would just be like a ball of water. So it's a massive amount of water there.
Wow. Wow.
So, yeah. And there's another important place is Greenland too. And Greenland has a very thick ice sheet. Again, it's about a mile thick. It's a much smaller area, but if all of the ice in Greenland melted, the seas would raise by 24 feet. Okay, so if this ice melts, this is really significant. It would raise sea level so much that all of our coastal cities, for example, they could actually be underwater.
Wow. 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 I mean, this is just, and so it's amazing. So just a couple of quick things. So one, would I be accurate then in saying that the primary concern relating to the ice melt is the rising sea levels, and that the main causes that we should be concerned about in the nearer term would be what happens to the ice on Greenland and in the Antarctic as opposed to the Arctic ice? Would that generally be accurate?
That's generally accurate, except if you're one of those people who actually lives in the Arctic. There's actually a lot of people who live there, and they're traditional communities who learn to survive in the most harshest of all possible circumstances. There's a tribe, the Inuit community lives there, and they rely on having all that ice because it allows them to efficiently hunt, and they literally build a society that relies on that. And if you're a polar bear, or if you're a walrus, or if you're a bird, you also rely on that ice. So that's what happens in nature, is that you have a particular ecosystem, and a whole web of life builds around that. So if we take it away, they're also going to be significantly impacted. And where there certainly aren't as many people who live up there as, in coastal cities, but it's still, very, very damaging to those communities to have the environment changing so much.
All right. Well, it's huge, and it's fascinating how important ice is. So it's kind of bringing it to, I always like to look at things from kind of a lay perspective, an arts perspective, right? So as an artist, as a violinist, I'm, hanging out down in Miami and, on the coast, and I go to the beach or I'm somewhere on the coastline, and I'm like, so let's say this were to, go up a couple inches. Doesn't seem like it would be that much difference. So can you kind of share with us what are we projecting that our water levels might increase or raise by, say, in the next 20 years or 30 years, and what impact will that actually have?
Right. So we don't know when and if the ice on the continents is going to melt. And in reality, the sea level rise, it's been rising at about 1.25 inches every 10 years. Okay. But actually, interestingly, that's not really caused by melting of the ice. Actually, that just is occurring because the ocean is also getting warmer due to climate change. And if you take water and you warm it up a little bit, it wants to expand. Okay. So that's actually been what's happening. And, yes, it's not that dramatic, massive, inundation of coastal areas. On the other hand, if we think about living on the coast, there's the average sea level. Okay, but you also have tides, and the tide, and there'll be time when the tides are really big. There's storm surge. And so even by having an increase, say, of 1 foot of increase in the water level of the ocean, those king tides, those storm surges can flood yet another distance inward. And actually, we're already seeing this today, particularly on the east coast of the United States, that there are areas where they've now had to start fortifying the shoreline because of sea level rise. And there are other parts of the world, like if you look at like a country like Bangladesh, that is very close to, many people live, basically at sea level. They even have homes over the water. And so sea level rise in that area has really been devastating. It's starting to displace millions and millions of people. So it's happening slowly, thank goodness. And, how much melting is really in our hands in many ways. If we can start reducing the emissions of carbon dioxide and other kinds of pollutants in the atmosphere, we can actually slow this melting down, and we can stop it. And maybe one day we can even reverse it.
Wow. Wow. Well, I mean, it is just unbelievably fascinating. And this is what I love about Artful Science. I learned so much with every episode. So unfortunately, we're just about out of time, but I always need to ask my guests, since we're at kind of the intersection of the arts and sciences, do you have any kind of arts practice that you do yourself, or an arts, discipline that you love?
Yeah, well, I don't know if you see this beautiful pastel behind
Yeah.
me. Now, that was not done by myself. That was done by a good family friend. So, number one, I love art on paper. I also do have my own art hobbies. I do watercolor painting. And I also do glass art. I have a kiln and I do fusing. So sometimes I make jewelry or coasters. So yes, I love the arts. I grew up in a family that immersed me in the arts, and I went to galleries. Almost every week we would go to some gallery. So yeah, love really all arts. I love music. I'm a huge fan of music. So
Truly amazing. Sally Benson, thank you for helping us gain knowledge through the lens of creativity here on Artful Science. Thanks so much.
thanks so much, Erin. This was a lot of fun. Terrific.